The metal detector's frantic beeping cut through the humid Florida morning like a prayer finally answered. Detective Sarah Chen knelt in the sandy soil beneath the sprawling live oak, her latex gloves already slick with sweat at 7:43 a.m. 20 years on the force had taught her that the earth keeps secrets poorly. Eventually, everything rises to the surface. "Got something here, Martinez," she called to her partner, who was photographing tire impressions near the tree line. The Hernando County Preserve stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of palmetto scrub and cypress swamps that had swallowed more than one soul over the decades. But today felt different. Today carried the electric anticipation that comes when cold cases suddenly turn hot. The object emerged slowly from the sandy loam, a silver charm bracelet, tarnished but intact. Sarah's breath caught. Even before she could make out the engravings, she knew. After 18 years, 3 months, and 16 days, they'd found something that belonged to Emma Castellanos. Emma. The name still carried weight in Brooksville, still made checkout clerks at the local Publix go quiet, still prompted strangers to cross themselves when driving past the faded missing person posters that somehow survived every hurricane season. Emma Castellanos. 17 years old, honor student, daughter of Manuel Castellanos, who ran Castellanos Auto Repair on Commercial Way. The girl who'd vanished on a humid Tuesday night in August 2005, leaving behind nothing but questions and a family that never stopped searching. Sarah held the bracelet up to the morning light filtering through the Spanish moss. The charms told Emma's story in miniature: a graduation cap, a tiny soccer ball, a cross, and, Sarah's pulse quickened, a small heart engraved with M and E forever. Miguel Santos, Emma's boyfriend, the boy who'd been questioned, cleared, questioned again, and finally left town under a cloud of suspicion that followed him like smoke. "Chen, you need to see this." Martinez's voice carried an odd tension. He was standing 30 feet away, near a cluster of saw palmetto, his face pale despite his deep tan. In 25 years with the department, Rodriguez Martinez had seen everything the Florida wilderness could produce. Whatever had shaken him was serious. Sarah carefully bagged the bracelet and made her way through the undergrowth. The preserve was waking up around them, mockingbirds testing their voices, armadillos rustling through the leaf litter, the distant splash of an alligator sliding into water. This was Emma's world, the place where she'd grown up hiking and camping with her father, back when Manuel still smiled and Rosa still sang while cooking dinner. What Martinez had found changed everything. Buried 18 inches down, wrapped in a moldering tarp, was a metal strongbox. Not buried deep enough to stay hidden forever, but deep enough that only persistent searching or pure accident would uncover it. The kind of burial that spoke of panic, of someone who needed to hide something quickly but couldn't bring themselves to destroy it entirely. Inside the box, protected by layers of plastic bags, was Emma's diary. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the water-stained cover. Emma's careful handwriting filled the pages, chronicling the last months of her life in the neat script that had earned her awards in English class. But these weren't the innocent musings of a teenager. These pages contained secrets that had festered in the Florida heat for nearly 2 decades, secrets that would shatter the comfortable narratives Brooksville had built around Emma's disappearance. The first entry that caught Sarah's attention was dated July 15, 2005. "He says if I tell anyone, he'll make sure I disappear. Not like running away disappear, like gone forever disappear. I don't know what to do. Mom and Dad trust him. Everyone trusts him, but I can't keep pretending everything is normal when I know what I know." Sarah flipped through more pages, her dread growing with each revelation. Emma had been scared, genuinely terrified in the weeks before she vanished. But scared of whom? The diary spoke of him without ever naming names, a deliberate omission that suggested Emma feared even her private thoughts being discovered.
"Martinez, we need to call this in. Full forensics team, search and rescue, the works." Sarah's voice was steady, but her mind was racing. 18 years of assuming Emma had been the victim of opportunity, of random violence, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this diary suggested something far more sinister, something planned, something personal, something that involved people Emma trusted. The preserve had given up one secret. How many more were buried in the sandy soil of Hernando County? As the morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows through the ancient oaks, Sarah found herself thinking about Emma's parents. Manuel, now in his 70s, still kept Emma's room exactly as she'd left it. Rosa had died 3 years ago, her heart finally giving out from the weight of not knowing. They deserved answers. The whole community deserved answers. But answers, Sarah knew, often came with a price. The radio crackled to life, dispatch calling about another development. A construction crew working on the new strip mall development had found what appeared to be more personal effects, items that matched the description of things Emma had been carrying the night she disappeared. The case that had gone cold in 2005 was suddenly burning hot in 2023, and Sarah had the sinking feeling that before it was over, a lot of people in Brooksville were going to discover that the past they thought they knew had been built on lies. Emma's diary contained 47 entries from her final summer, 47 windows into a nightmare that no 17-year-old should have had to live. As Sarah carefully turned the pages, she began to understand that Emma Castellanos hadn't just vanished, she'd been silenced. And whoever had silenced her had been living freely in Brooksville for nearly 2 decades, confident that their secret was buried deep enough to stay hidden forever. They'd been wrong. The metal detector beeped again, 20 feet from where they'd found the diary, then again near the edge of the clearing. The preserve was giving up its secrets all at once, as if 18 years of silence had finally become too much to bear. Sarah looked at her watch. 8:15 a.m. In 12 hours, the evening news would be running stories about the breakthrough in the Emma Castellanos case. By tomorrow morning, reporters would be descending on Brooksville like locusts. The comfortable quiet of the small Florida town was about to be shattered. But first, they had to figure out exactly what Emma had discovered that was worth killing for, and more importantly, who in their tight-knit community had been capable of murdering a 17-year-old girl to keep their secret safe. The answers were all here, buried in the sandy slill of the preserve. All they had to do was keep digging. Detective Sarah Chen had never intended to become the keeper of Brooksville's darkest secrets. Growing up in Tampa, she'd pictured herself working major crimes in a big city, solving cases that made headlines, building a reputation that would take her to the FBI or maybe private consulting. Instead, 18 years ago, she'd taken what was supposed to be a temporary position with the Hernando County Sheriff's Department and somehow never left. The Emma Castellanos case had been her first major investigation as a detective. Fresh out of the academy, eager to prove herself, she'd thrown everything she had at finding the missing girl. She'd interviewed every classmate, every teacher, every adult who'd had contact with Emma in the weeks before she vanished. She'd spent sleepless nights poring over timeline charts and evidence photos, convinced that the answer was right there if she could just see it clearly enough. But the case had gone cold, as cases sometimes do. The leads dried up, the tips stopped coming, and eventually the department moved on to newer emergencies. Sarah had never moved on. Every year on the anniversary of Emma's disappearance, Sarah drove out to the preserve. She'd park her cruiser at the entrance and walk the trails, not really searching anymore, just remembering. Remembering Emma's parents sitting in the interview room, holding hands tightly, their knuckles turned white. Remembering the searches that turned up nothing, remembering the gradual shift from hope to resignation in Rosa Castellanos' eyes. Now, sitting in her kitchen at 5 a.m. the morning after finding the diary, Sarah couldn't stop her hands from shaking as she held her coffee mug. She'd been a cop long enough to develop armor against the darkness she encountered, but this felt different. This felt personal in a way that professional distance couldn't protect against. She'd read every entry in Emma's diary twice, taking meticulous notes, cross-referencing dates with the original case file. The picture that emerged was devastating. Emma hadn't been a random victim. She'd been systematically terrorized for months by someone she knew, someone with power over her, someone whose threats were specific enough to convince a brave, intelligent girl that silence was her only option for survival. He came to the house again today when Dad was at work, Mom was at her book club. He knows their schedules better than I do. He brought flowers for Mom, said he was just checking on us because Dad mentioned I'd been moody lately. But when she went to put them in water, he cornered me in the hallway. He said my attitude was becoming a problem. He said people who cause problems for their families sometimes find themselves in situations they can't get out of. Sarah rubbed her temples. The entries were full of similar veiled threats, references to him that could apply to any number of men in Emma's orbit, her father's friends, her teachers, family members, neighbors. Emma had been careful never to write the name, but the fear bled through every word. The phone rang. Sarah glanced at the clock. 5:23 a.m. Only bad news called this early. Chen. Sarah, it's Martinez. You need to get down here. We've got a situation at the Castellanos house. Manuel Castellanos was sitting on his front porch in the pre-dawn darkness, still wearing the same clothes from yesterday, Emma's diary clutched against his chest like a life preserver. He'd been there since midnight, neighbors reported, just sitting and rocking in the old wooden chair Rosa used to occupy while she waited for news that never came. Sarah approached slowly. Manuel was 73 now, his hair completely white, his hands gnarled from decades of auto repair work. But his eyes were alert, blazing with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite identify. Rage? Relief? Resolution? She tried to tell me, he said without looking up. In those last weeks, she kept trying to tell me something, but I was so busy with the shop, so worried about money, so... His voice cracked. I failed her, detective. I failed my little girl. Sarah settled into the chair beside him, the same chair Rosa had occupied during countless interviews over the years. Manuel, we're going to find out what happened to Emma. This diary is the break we've been waiting for. It's too late. Manuel's voice was hollow. Rosa died not knowing. She died thinking Emma might still be out there somewhere, might still come home. I let her believe that because I couldn't stand to give up hope. But Emma's dead, isn't she? Has been all along. Sarah had learned not to make promises she couldn't keep. We don't know that yet, but we're going to follow every lead and investigate every possibility. Manuel handed her a shoebox. Rosa kept everything, every flyer, every newspaper article, every letter from psychics claiming they could find Emma. She never stopped believing. He opened the box with reverent care. Inside were hundreds of items, faded photos, Emma's report cards, letters from other families of missing children, even a small teddy bear that had been Emma's favorite when she was little. At the bottom of the box was a manila envelope marked, "For Detective Chen," in Rosa's careful handwriting. She made me promise to give this to you if we ever found out what happened. She said you were the only one who never stopped caring. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter, dated just 6 months before Rosa's death. Dear Detective Chen, if you're reading this, then somehow the truth has finally come out about what happened to our Emma. I know you blame yourself for not solving her case, but you need to know that Manuel and I never blamed you. We knew you did everything you could. I'm writing this because I've been having dreams about Emma lately. Not sad dreams. She seems at peace. But she keeps trying to tell me something about the night she disappeared. She keeps pointing to her diary, the one we could never find. She keeps saying, "Tell Detective Chen to look deeper. Tell her it's not what everyone thinks." I don't know what that means, but Emma was always smarter than the rest of us. If she's trying to send a message, it's important. Please, don't let our Emma be forgotten. With love and gratitude, Rosa Castellanos. Sarah wiped her eyes. In 18 years of police work, she'd never received a letter from beyond the grave. But that's what this felt like.
Rosa reaching across the divide between the living and the dead to make sure Emma's voice was finally heard. The sun was coming up now, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that Emma would have loved. She'd been an artist, always sketching in the margins of her notebooks, always seeing beauty in the ordinary Florida landscape that most people took for granted. Manuel, I need to ask you some difficult questions about Emma's life. Her teachers, your friends, family members, anyone who had regular contact with her. Manuel nodded. I've been thinking about that all night. Reading her diary, remembering those last few weeks. She changed, Detective. My bright, cheerful girl became quiet and nervous. She stopped eating Rosa's cooking, stopped calling her friends. She started locking her bedroom door, something she'd never done before. Did she mention being afraid of anyone specifically? No, but... Manuel hesitated. There was something. The week before she disappeared, she asked me if we could move away. Said she'd gotten a scholarship offer from a school in North Carolina that I knew she'd never applied to. When I questioned her about it, she started crying and said it would be better if she just went away to college early. Sarah made notes. Emma had been planning to escape. Whatever was terrorizing her had reached the point where leaving everything behind seemed like the only solution. Is there anyone from back then who made you uncomfortable? Anyone who seemed too interested in Emma? Manuel was quiet for a long time. Detective, I've been asking myself that same question for 18 years, and the truth is, everyone seemed too interested in Emma. She was a beautiful girl, smart, kind. Men noticed her. But back then, I thought that was normal. I thought that was just part of having a teenage daughter. The morning was warming up, and neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the unusual activity. Sarah recognized some faces from the original investigation, people who'd searched the woods, hung flyers, organized prayer vigils. Brooksville was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, which made it even more remarkable that Emma's tormentor had managed to operate in secret. We're going to need to re-interview everyone from the original investigation, Sarah told Manuel. The diary gives us new questions to ask, new angles to explore. Someone out there knows more than they told us in 2005. Manuel stood up slowly, his joints protesting after the long night in the chair. Detective, there's something else Rosa wanted you to know. She said Emma came to her in a dream once,
Told her that the truth was hidden in plain sight, that the person who heard her was someone we all trusted, someone who was pretending to help find her. The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Someone who was pretending to help. Someone who'd been part of the search effort, the investigation, the community response. Someone who'd hidden in plain sight for 18 years, watching the family grieve, watching the case go cold, confident that their secret was safe. But secrets had a way of surfacing in Florida. The sandy soil couldn't hold them forever. The Brooksville Community Center hadn't seen this many people since the hurricane shelter operations of 2004. By 10 a.m., every folding chair was occupied, and overflow crowds spilled out into the parking lot, where someone had set up speakers so everyone could hear the press conference. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at faces she'd known for 2 decades, some hopeful, some fearful, all desperate for answers. Sheriff James Morrison stepped up to the microphone first, his weathered face grave. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday morning we recovered significant evidence in the Emma Castellanos case. After 18 years, we have new leads to pursue and new hope that we can finally bring closure to the Castellanos family and our community. The crowd erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, and scattered applause. Sarah watched the faces, the way people glanced at each other, the subtle shifts in body language that suggested guilt, relief, or surprise. Somewhere in this crowd was Emma's killer. and they were hearing for the first time that their perfect crime was about to unravel. We are asking anyone with information about Emma's disappearance to come forward. New evidence suggests that Emma was being threatened in the weeks before she vanished. We believe someone in our community knows more than they've previously shared. In the third row, Margaret Henley, Emma's former English teacher, went pale. 2 rows behind her, David Kim, who'd been Emma's guidance counselor, looked like he might be sick. Near the back, Police Chief Rick Banner, who'd been a patrol officer in 2005, kept checking his phone with unusual intensity. The questions came fast and aggressive. What kind of evidence? Do you have a suspect? Why now after all these years? Sarah deflected most inquiries, but she made sure to emphasize one crucial point. We have reason to believe Emma's death was not random. She knew her killer. More importantly, her killer was someone the community trusted, someone who may have been involved in the original search efforts. That last statement sent ripples through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Sarah watched his friends exchanged glances as married couples seemed to study each other with new suspicion, as the comfortable certainties of small-town life began to crack under the weight of possibility. After the press conference, Sarah's phone didn't stop ringing. By noon, she'd fielded calls from 3 major news networks, 2 true crime podcasters, and a documentary filmmaker who'd been following cold cases in rural Florida. But the calls that mattered came from locals. The first significant tip came from Janet Morse, who'd been the school secretary in 2005. Detective Chen, I don't know if this means anything, but I've been thinking about something for 18 years. The day after Emma disappeared, someone broke into the school filing system. They didn't take anything valuable, just accessed some student records, including Emma's. We never could figure out who or why. The second call was from Tommy Rodriguez, now a successful contractor, but then a teenage boy with a crush on Emma. She was scared of someone, really scared. I offered to walk her home from school a few times that last week, and she kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. When I asked who, she just said it was someone her family trusted, someone who would never believe me if I told them. By evening, Sarah had compiled a list of 37 people who'd had regular contact with Emma in the summer of 2005. Teachers, coaches, family friends, neighbors, shop owners where she worked part-time, volunteer coordinators from the church youth group. 37 people who'd been interviewed 18 years ago and cleared. 37 people who would need to be interviewed again. But one name kept surfacing in the calls. Father Miguel Santos, not to be confused with Miguel Santos, Emma's boyfriend. Father Santos had been the associate pastor at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where the Castellanos family attended faithfully. He'd been 32 years old in 2005, charismatic, beloved by the congregation, especially popular with the youth group that Emma had been active in. He'd led the church's search efforts, organized prayer vigils, counseled the family through their darkest hours. And according to 3 separate callers, he'd left town abruptly in November 2005, just 3 months after Emma's disappearance. The official story was that he'd been transferred to a parish in South America as part of a missionary program. But Sarah's calls to the diocese had yielded only vague responses and promises to look into the matter. That evening, Sarah sat in her office reading Emma's diary for the 4th time, focusing on entries from the last month before she vanished. He says, "I'm special, that God has given him a responsibility to guide me. But the way he looks at me doesn't feel holy. When he puts his hand on my shoulder during youth group, I want to run away. But who would believe me? Everyone thinks he's a saint." I told Mom I didn't want to go to youth group anymore. She got upset, said I was going through a rebellious phase and that Father Santos was worried about me. She doesn't understand. He's the reason I can't sleep at night. I'm thinking about telling Miguel, my boyfriend Miguel, not the priest. But what if Father Santos finds out? He said that people who spread lies about men of God end up facing divine judgment. I don't want anything bad to happen to my family. The pattern was becoming clear. Father Santos had been grooming Emma, using his position of authority and trust to isolate her, to make her feel responsible for his behavior, to convince her that speaking out would bring consequences she couldn't handle. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. "Got something big. Meet me at the station ASAP." When Sarah arrived, Martinez was hunched over his computer, surrounded by printouts and coffee cups. "I've been digging into Father Santos's background," he said without preamble. "Turns out his missionary work in South America lasted exactly 6 months. Then he disappeared from church records entirely." "What do you mean, disappeared?" "I mean, no forwarding address, no new parish assignments, no pension communications. It's like he vanished." But here's the interesting part. In 2007, a Miguel Santos was arrested in Phoenix on charges of sexual assault against a minor. Case was dismissed on a technicality, but the physical description matches our priest. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Same guy? Gets better. I traced property records, employment history, everything I could find. Miguel Santos, and I'm pretty sure it's the same Miguel Santos who was Father Santos, has been living in Clearwater under an assumed name for the past 12 years. He runs a youth counseling center. The irony was nauseating. Emma's killer had spent more than a decade with access to vulnerable children, hiding behind a new identity but pursuing the same predatory behavior that had cost Emma her life. Do we have enough for an arrest warrant? Martinez shook his head. Not yet. The diary entries don't name him directly, and we still don't have physical evidence linking him to Emma's murder, but we have enough to bring him in for questioning.
Sarah's phone rang again. This time, it was Dr. Patricia Vega, the medical examiner. "Sarah, I've got preliminary results on that metal box you found with the diary. The box itself is interesting. Custom-made, expensive, with a small engraving on the bottom. MS 2005. But that's not the big news." Sarah's heart rate accelerated. "What's the big news?" "We found DNA on the diary, male DNA that doesn't match anyone in the system. But Sarah, we also found something else in that box, something that wasn't in your evidence report." "What?" "A confession. A handwritten letter addressed to Emma's parents. It's been in there all along, but it was stuck to the bottom of the box with some kind of adhesive. My team only found it during detailed processing." Sarah felt the world shift around her. "What does it say?" "You need to see it for yourself. But Sarah, this changes everything. The person who killed Emma didn't just bury the evidence. They buried a full confession, like they couldn't live with the guilt, but couldn't bring themselves to face the consequences either." 20 minutes later, Sarah was staring at 3 pages of handwritten text, the ink faded but still legible. "To the family of Emma Castellanos. I am a coward. I am a monster. I am the reason your beautiful daughter is dead, and I will carry that weight for the rest of my life. Emma tried to tell people what I was doing to her. She tried to get help. But I had convinced everyone that I was holy, that I was trustworthy, that any accusations against me would be the lies of a troubled teenager. I used my position, my collar, my reputation to silence her before she could speak. On the night of August 23, 2005, Emma called me. She said she had decided to tell her parents everything, no matter what happened to me. She said she couldn't live with the secret anymore, that she'd rather face my threats than continue living in fear. I went to meet her at the preserve where she said she'd be walking and thinking. I went there planning to convince her to stay quiet, to promise that I would transfer to another parish to offer whatever lies might keep her from destroying my life. But when I saw her there, so young and so brave and so determined to finally tell the truth, I realized that nothing I could say would stop her. She had found her courage, and my lies would no longer work. I never intended to hurt her, but when she turned to walk away,
When she said she was going straight home to tell her parents, something inside me broke. I couldn't let my life be destroyed by a 17-year-old girl. I couldn't let everything I had worked for disappear because I had been weak and sinful and predatory. I am not writing this to excuse what I did. There is no excuse. Emma Castellanos died because I was a selfish, evil man who valued his reputation more than an innocent girl's life. I buried her in a place where she will never be found. I buried this confession because I am too much of a coward to face what I have done, but too tormented by guilt to let her disappear without someone knowing the truth. If you are reading this, then God has finally decided that justice should be served. I am sorry. I am so sorry. But sorry will never bring Emma back, and sorry will never give you the peace you deserve. Father Miguel Santos, St. Mary's Catholic Church, August 27, 2005. Sarah read the confession 3 times before her hands stopped shaking enough to set it down. Emma had been murdered by a trusted authority figure who had spent months grooming and threatening her. She'd been killed for the crime of finding the courage to speak truth about power. But the confession raised as many questions as it answered. Father Santos had claimed he'd buried Emma in a place where she will never be found. So where was her body? And if he'd buried this confession in 2005, how had he lived with himself for 18 years? How had he built a new life, pursued new victims, continued the cycle of abuse that had killed Emma?
The phone rang again. Martinez picked it up, listened for a moment, then covered the mouthpiece. Sarah, that was the Clearwater PD. Miguel Santos is dead. Has been for 3 days. Apparent suicide. Sarah felt the case slipping away from them even as they'd finally found the truth. Did he leave a note? Yeah, but you're not going to like it. He says there are others. He says Emma wasn't the only one. The drive to Clearwater took 47 minutes. 47 minutes for Sarah to process the reality that their primary suspect was dead and their case had just exploded into something far more complex than a single murder. Miguel Santos had left behind more than just a suicide note. He'd left a roadmap to 2 decades of predatory behavior that stretched across 3 states and involved at least 12 victims. The house where Santos had been living was unremarkable, a modest ranch-style home in a middle-class neighborhood where he'd been known as Mike Sandoval, a quiet man who ran a youth counseling service and volunteered at the local community center. His neighbors described him as helpful, polite, and trustworthy, the perfect disguise for a monster. Detective Lisa Park from Clearwater PD met Sarah and Martinez at the scene. Your guy was methodical, she said, leading them through the house. Everything's organized, labeled, documented. It's like he was running a business. The back bedroom had been converted into an office, and it was there that Santos had stored his secrets. Filing cabinets full of photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, and detailed notes about potential victims. A computer with encrypted files that would take the state crime lab weeks to fully decode. And on the desk, a stack of handwritten pages that constituted his final confession. Sarah read the suicide note with growing horror. I cannot live with what I have done any longer. The news about Emma Castellanos' case being reopened has made it clear that my past will soon catch up with me. Rather than face the shame and consequences, I am choosing to end my life. But before I die, I need to confess to more than Emma's murder. She was not my only victim. Over the past 18 years, I have abused my position of trust to harm children in Phoenix, Tucson, Atlanta, Jacksonville, and here in Clearwater. I have detailed records of my crimes in the filing cabinet marked counseling sessions. Emma Castellanos died because she was brave enough to threaten my secret. The other children I hurt lived because they were too scared or too broken to speak. I am a predator who used faith, authority, and trust as weapons against the innocent. Emma's body is buried behind the old Texaco station on Route 50, approximately 200 yards into the woods, beneath a pile of concrete blocks that I told people were construction debris from a church renovation project. She deserves a proper burial, and her family deserves to lay her to rest. I am a coward who chose death over accountability, but I cannot take these secrets with me into whatever judgment awaits.
Miguel Santos, also known as Miguel Sandoval, Father Miguel Santos, Michael Sand, and Michael Santos. Sarah looked up from the letter to find Detective Park watching her carefully. "There's more," Park said. "A lot more. Your victim Emma seems to have been his first murder, but definitely not his first crime. We found evidence of systematic abuse going back to his seminary days."
The filing cabinet marked counseling sessions contained the detailed documentation of Santos's crimes. Photos, videos, written accounts, and what appeared to be psychological profiles of his victims, all organized by date, location, and level of perceived threat to his security. It was the archive of a serial predator who had treated child abuse like a science experiment. But it was the folder marked Emma C., the problem, that made Sarah's hands shake as she read. Santos had been stalking Emma for months before her disappearance, documenting her routines, her relationships, her vulnerabilities. He'd photographed her walking to school, working at her part-time job, attending youth group activities. He'd compiled detailed notes about her personality, her family situation, her strengths and weaknesses. "Subject is intelligent and strong-willed," one entry read. "Traditional intimidation tactics less effective than with previous subjects. She has close family relationships and strong moral compass that makes her likely to eventually report inappropriate contact. Risk level high. Containment may require permanent solution." Another entry, dated just a week before Emma's murder. "Subject has begun avoiding one-on-one encounters and has stopped participating in youth group activities. Her behavior suggests she is preparing to report incidents to family or authorities. Timeline for permanent resolution, immediate." Sarah felt sick reading Santos's clinical analysis of Emma's final weeks, the way he'd studied her like a specimen, calculated the threat she posed to his freedom, and planned her elimination with the same detached precision he'd used to document his other crimes. Martinez was examining another filing cabinet. "Sarah, you need to see this. He's got detailed records of the search efforts for Emma. Names, addresses, schedules of every volunteer. He was right there, helping coordinate the searches while knowing exactly where she was buried." The cynicism was breathtaking. Santos had not only participated in the search for Emma, he'd helped organize it. He'd comforted her parents, led prayer services, and coordinated volunteer efforts while knowing that their daughter was dead and buried less than 20 miles away. But the most disturbing discovery was a folder labeled Future Risks. Inside were profiles of other children who'd been in Emma's youth group, other families who attended St. Mary's, other potential victims who might have witnessed Santos's inappropriate behavior with Emma. One profile made Sarah's blood run cold. Melissa Castellanos, Emma's younger sister, age 14. Present during several incidents where subject Emma showed signs of distress after counseling sessions, may have overheard conversations or observed behavioral changes that could lead to questions. High intelligence like her sister. Should be monitored for signs of suspicion. If necessary, elimination may be required to maintain security. Santos had been planning to kill Emma's younger sister. Melissa was now 32 years old, married, living in Orlando with 2 young children. She'd grown up in the shadow of her sister's disappearance, had struggled with survivor's guilt and anxiety for years, had undergone therapy and medication to cope with the trauma of losing Emma. And all the while, she'd been on a predator's hit list, marked for death simply because she might have known too much about her sister's final weeks. Sarah called Melissa immediately. "Detective Chen, is this about Emma? Did you find something?" Sarah tried to keep her voice steady. "Melissa, we need to talk, in person. Can you meet me today?" "Did you find her body?" Melissa's voice broke. "Please, tell me you found her body."
We found answers, Melissa. Important answers that you need to hear directly from me. Can you come to the station, or would you prefer I come to you?
3 hours later, Sarah sat in Melissa's living room in Orlando, watching a grown woman crumble as she learned the truth about her sister's death. Melissa's husband held their sleeping toddler while their older daughter played in the backyard, oblivious to the family trauma being reopened in the living room. "He was going to kill me too," Melissa whispered after Sarah had explained about the profile in Santos's files. "All those years I felt guilty for surviving when Emma didn't, and he was actually planning to murder me." "Melissa, I need to ask you some difficult questions about Father Santos in your interactions with him after Emma disappeared." Melissa wiped her eyes. "He was so kind to us. After Emma disappeared, he came to the house almost every day. He brought food, he prayed with us, he organized the searches. Mom and Dad thought he was an angel sent by God to help us through the worst time of our lives." Sarah made notes, trying to remain professional while her heart broke for this family that had been manipulated by their daughter's killer. "Did he ever ask you questions about Emma, about things she might have said or done in those last few weeks?" "Constantly." Melissa's voice grew stronger as she remembered. "He said it was important for the investigation, that the police needed to understand Emma's state of mind. He asked if she'd seemed upset about anything, if she'd mentioned having problems with anyone, if she'd said anything about wanting to run away." "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that Emma had been acting strange, nervous, scared of something. But when I told him that, he got this look on his face. Not concerned like you'd expect from a priest, more like relieved? Like that was the answer he wanted to hear?" Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. Santos had been conducting his own investigation, not to help find Emma, but to make sure no one suspected him. He'd used his position as the family's spiritual counselor to gather intelligence about what Emma might have told her sister, what evidence might exist, what threats to his security he needed to address. "Melissa, did Father Santos ever try to be alone with you after Emma disappeared?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Melissa looked at her husband, then back at Sarah. "Yes, multiple times. He said I needed private counseling to deal with my grief, that there were things I could only discuss with a priest. My parents thought it was a wonderful idea, but you didn't want to do it. I don't know why, but being alone with him made me feel sick, like there was something wrong with him, something dangerous. I always made excuses, said I wasn't ready, asked if we could wait until Mom or Dad could be present. He got frustrated with me, said I wasn't taking my spiritual healing seriously." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. Text: "Found Emma. Santos wasn't lying about the location. Body recovered. Positive ID confirmed. Medical examiner says the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull." Sarah excused herself and stepped onto Melissa's porch to call Martinez. The Florida afternoon was humid and oppressive, but she felt cold all over. "Tell me," she said when Martinez answered. "She was buried exactly where he said, behind the old Texaco station, wrapped in a tarp, covered with concrete blocks. Medical examiner says the injury pattern is consistent with being struck by a heavy object, maybe a rock or a piece of concrete. Sarah, there's something else. She was wearing her youth group t-shirt when she died." The detail hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma had been wearing her St. Mary's youth group shirt, the same youth group led by the man who killed her when she died. The symbolism was nauseating. "What about time of death?"
Emmy says August 23, 2005, consistent with when she disappeared. But Sarah, there's more. We found physical evidence on her clothing, DNA that matches samples from Santos's house. After 18 years, we finally have forensic proof. Sarah returned to the living room where Melissa was holding her daughter, both of them crying quietly. "We found her," Sarah said simply. "We found Emma." The sound Melissa made wasn't quite a cry or a scream. It was the sound of 18 years of grief finally finding release. Her husband held both his wife and daughter while they sobbed, and Sarah had to step outside again to compose herself. But there was more work to do. The discovery of Emma's body was just the beginning. Santos's files had revealed a network of abuse that stretched across multiple states and decades. There were other victims who deserved justice, other families who deserved answers, other predators who might still be operating with impunity. Sarah's phone rang. It was Sheriff Morrison. "Chen, we've got a problem. 3 more families have come forward since the news broke about finding Emma's body. All of them say their children were abused by Father Santos during his time at St. Mary's. But that's not the problem." "What's the problem?" 2 of the families say church officials knew about the abuse and covered it up. They say they reported Santos's behavior to the bishop in 2005, weeks before Emma disappeared. If that's true, then Emma died because the church chose to protect a predator instead of the children in his care. Sarah closed her eyes. The case was expanding again, reaching into institutions and hierarchies that had the power to destroy evidence, silence victims, and ruin careers. Fighting a dead pedophile was one thing. Fighting the Catholic Church was something else entirely. "Sheriff, we need to contact the diocesan offices immediately. We need to see all records related to Father Santos, all complaints filed against him during his time at St. Mary's." "Already tried. Their lawyers are claiming privilege, saying internal church communications are protected. They're stonewalling us completely." "Then we go public. We hold another press conference and ask anyone with information about church officials covering up Santos's crimes to come forward." "Chen, are you sure you want to take on the Catholic Church? They have resources, lawyers, political connections that we can't match. This could destroy your career." Sarah looked back through the window at Melissa holding her daughter, at a family finally getting the answers they deserved after 18 years of suffering. She thought about Emma, 17 years old and brave enough to threaten a predator's secret even when she knew it might cost her life. She thought about all the other victims who'd been too scared or too broken to speak, and about the victims who might exist in the future if the whole truth didn't come out. "Sheriff, Emma Castellanos died because powerful people chose to protect an institution instead of a child. I won't let that happen again. We follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to the Vatican." That evening, Sarah sat in her office surrounded by boxes of evidence from Santos's house. Photos of victims, letters from parents asking for help, news clippings about missing children, and detailed notes about grooming techniques and victim selection. It was the library of a monster, but it was also a roadmap to justice for crimes that had been hidden for decades. The phone rang constantly. Reporters, victim advocates, other police departments reporting similar cases, and most heartbreakingly, other victims calling to say they'd been abused by Father Santos but had never reported it because they didn't think anyone would believe them. By midnight, Sarah had compiled a list of 43 potential victims across 4 states, ranging in age from 8 to 17 at the time of their abuse. 43 children whose lives had been damaged or destroyed by one man's predatory behavior and the institutions that enabled him. But the most important call came at 12:47 a.m. "Detective Chen, this is Bishop Thomas McCarthy from the Diocese of St. Petersburg. I understand you've been trying to reach our offices about Father Miguel Santos." "Yes, Your Excellency. We need access to all records related to Father Santos, including any complaints filed against him during his time at St. Mary's." There was a long pause. "Detective, I'm calling because I believe it's time for the truth to come out. We did receive complaints about Father Santos in 2005, multiple complaints, and yes, we failed to act appropriately. I've been carrying the weight of that failure for 18 years, and I can't carry it anymore." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Are you willing to cooperate with our investigation?"
More than cooperate, Detective. I'm willing to testify. The church's handling of Father Santos was criminally negligent, and Emma Castellanos died because of our failures. I can't bring her back, but I can make sure the truth is finally told. Detective, why are you coming forward now?
Another long pause. Because I have a granddaughter who's 17 years old, Detective, the same age Emma was when she died. And I realize that my silence hasn't protected the church. It's just enabled more predators and claimed more victims. Emma deserved better from us. All the children deserved better. Sarah looked at the clock. 12:52 a.m., September 24, 2023. 18 years, 1 month, and 1 day after Emma Castellanos disappeared, the institutional cover-up that had enabled her murder was finally beginning to crumble. But Sarah knew that true justice would require more than just solving Emma's murder. It would require exposing the entire network of abuse and cover-up that had allowed Santos to operate for decades. It would require holding accountable not just the predator, but the system that had protected him and enabled his crimes. Emma had died trying to speak truth to power. Now it was time for power to finally listen. 6 months after Emma Castellanos' body was found, Brooksville looked like a different town. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a cautious hope that truth might actually lead to justice. The St. Mary's Catholic Church sat mostly empty on Sunday mornings, its congregation scattered to other parishes or lost to faith entirely. The building that had once been the center of community life now stood as a monument to institutional negligence and the cost of silence. Sarah stood in the church parking lot on a humid March morning, watching as workers installed a memorial garden where Emma's youth group used to meet for outdoor activities. The garden was Melissa's idea, a place where the community could remember not just Emma, but all the victims whose voices had been silenced by predators and the systems that protected them. The bronze plaque at the center of the garden read simply, "In memory of Emma Castellanos and all children failed by those they trusted, may their courage inspire our vigilance." Manuel Castellanos, now 74, but somehow looking younger than he had in years, was supervising the installation of the memorial roses. Emma had loved roses, especially the pale pink ones that Rosa had grown in their backyard. Seeing her daughter's favorite flowers blooming in what had been the site of her torment seemed to bring him a peace that 18 years of not knowing had made impossible. She would have been 35 this year, Manuel told Sarah as they watched the workers. Would have had children of her own, maybe. A career, a husband who loved her, a life full of all the things he stole from her. Sarah nodded. The arithmetic of loss was always devastating. All the birthdays, graduations, weddings, grandchildren that would never exist because a predator had decided his secret was worth more than a child's life. But there was something else in Manuel's voice now, something that wasn't there during the 18 years of not knowing. Resolution. Closure. The ability to grieve properly because he finally understood what he was grieving. The investigation had expanded far beyond Emma's murder. Bishop McCarthy had been true to his word, providing the diocese complete files on Father Santos and the complaints that had been ignored in 2005. The records revealed a pattern of institutional negligence that was both systematic and deliberate. 3 families had reported Santos's inappropriate behavior to church officials in the 6 months before Emma's disappearance. Parents had written detailed letters describing their children's accounts of abuse. Youth group members had complained to other church staff about Santos's behavior during overnight retreats and private counseling sessions. Multiple red flags had been raised, documented, and filed away without action. The church's response had been consistent: transfer the problem rather than address it.
Santos had been scheduled for reassignment to a parish in Colombia, where he would have had access to new victims in a community with even fewer resources to protect their children. Emma's threat to expose him had disrupted that plan and cost her life. The criminal investigation had led to charges against 3 church officials for conspiracy to obstruct justice and child endangerment. The civil lawsuits had resulted in a $47 million settlement fund for Santos's victims. But more importantly, the case had prompted legislative changes that would make it harder for institutions to hide predators and easier for victims to seek justice. Emma's Law, passed by the Florida legislature in February 2024, extended the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse cases and created mandatory reporting requirements for institutional officials who received complaints about potential abuse. It also established victim advocacy programs and funding for trauma counseling. Sarah had testified before the legislative committee considering the bill, reading excerpts from Emma's diary that brought several lawmakers to tears. Emma Castellanos died trying to speak truth to power. The least we can do is make sure other children don't die for the same reason. Emma's Law had been covered by national media, turning Emma's story into a symbol of institutional accountability and victim advocacy. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't the legislative change or the media attention. It was the phone calls from other victims who finally felt safe enough to come forward. The emails from parents who now knew the warning signs to watch for. The knowledge that Emma's courage had inspired others to speak truth even when it was dangerous. On a warm April morning, Sarah received a call that brought the case full circle. Detective Chen, this is Agent Rebecca Torres with the FBI. We've been working with international law enforcement to track down other victims of Miguel Santos from his time in Colombia. I wanted to let you know that we've identified 12 additional victims and arrested 2 church officials who helped cover up his crimes there.
Sarah felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but it came at the cost of knowing that more children had suffered while Santos evaded accountability for Emma's murder. Agent Torres, what can you tell me about his time in Colombia? The same pattern as Florida, grooming vulnerable children, using his religious authority to silence them, moving on when the situation became too risky. But detective, there's something else. We found journals in his belongings that reference Emma specifically. He never stopped thinking about her, never stopped being haunted by what he'd done. Sarah wasn't sure if that knowledge made her feel better or worse. Santos had spent 18 years living with the guilt of Emma's murder, but he'd also spent 18 years creating new victims instead of turning himself in. His guilt hadn't prevented him from continuing to harm children. It had just made him more careful about covering his tracks. The 1-year anniversary of Emma's body being found was marked by a community memorial service that drew people from across Florida, families who'd lost children to predators, survivors of institutional abuse, law enforcement officers who'd worked cold cases, and ordinary citizens who'd been inspired by Emma's story. Melissa spoke at the memorial, her voice strong and clear as she addressed the crowd gathered in Brooksville Central Park. My sister Emma was 17 years old when she made the hardest decision a child should ever have to make. She chose to speak truth about someone the community trusted, knowing it might cost her everything. She was braver than any adult in this story, braver than the church officials who chose silence, braver than the community leaders who chose comfort over justice. Emma died because she refused to be silent, but her death won't be silent. Every law that's changed, every victim who finds the courage to speak, every child who grows up safer because of what we've learned, that's Emma's voice, still speaking, still fighting for justice. The memorial service concluded with the planting of an oak tree, the same species that had sheltered the preserve where Emma's diary was found. The tree would grow for decades, its roots deepening with each passing year, its branches reaching toward the sky. Like Emma's legacy, It would outlive everyone present, a living reminder that some truths are too important to stay buried. That evening, Sarah sat on her porch reading through the latest batch of letters from crime victims and their families. Emma's story had resonated far beyond Florida, inspiring other cold case investigations, prompting other institutional reforms, giving other families hope that their own searches for truth might eventually succeed. But the letter that moved her most came from a 13-year-old girl in Oregon. Dear Detective Chen, I saw a documentary about Emma Castellanos and wanted to thank you for not giving up on her. I was being hurt by someone my family trusted, and I was scared to tell anyone because I thought no one would believe me. But after hearing Emma's story, I found the courage to tell my mom what was happening. The person who was hurting me is in jail now, and I'm getting help to heal from what happened. I know Emma is dead and can't be saved, but her story saved me. Please tell her family that she's still protecting kids, even though she's gone. Thank you for making sure her voice was heard. A girl who's not afraid anymore. Sarah wiped her eyes and added the letter to the growing collection of testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by Emma's story. This was the real measure of justice. Not the convictions or the settlements or the legislative reforms, but the individual lives that were saved because a 17-year-old girl had been brave enough to threaten a predator's secret and because a community had finally been willing to listen to her voice. The phone rang. Sarah almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed Manuel Castellanos. Detective Chen, I wanted to thank you. Today marks 1 year since we found Emma, and I realized something. For 18 years, I was angry at God for taking my daughter, but I understand now that God didn't take Emma. A man took Emma. A man who was supposed to serve God, but served only himself. Manuel's voice was steady, peaceful. Emma is with Rosa now, and they're both at peace. But more than that, Emma's story is still helping children. That's the daughter I raised. Someone who would rather die than let others be hurt. Her courage didn't end with her death. It's still spreading, still protecting kids, still changing the world. Manuel, Emma would be so proud of you and Melissa. You've made sure her death meant something. No, detective, you made sure her death meant something. You never stopped listening for her voice, even when it took 18 years to hear it clearly. Emma trusted you to find the truth, and you kept that trust. After they hung up, Sarah sat in the gathering darkness thinking about voice and silence, about courage and consequence, about the price of truth and the cost of comfortable lies. Emma Castellanos was dead for 18 years, but her voice was louder now than it had ever been in life. Her story had become a rallying cry for institutional accountability, victim advocacy, and the protection of children.
But most importantly, Emma's voice had given other children permission to speak, to seek help, to believe that their truth mattered more than anyone's comfort or reputation. In dying for her courage, Emma had taught others how to live with theirs. The memorial oak tree would grow strong and tall, its roots anchored deep in Florida soil. Like Emma's legacy, it would shelter future generations, its branches reaching toward light, its strength drawn from the darkness it had overcome. 3 years later, August 2026, the Emma Castellanos Center for Child Advocacy opened on a brilliant summer morning in downtown Brooksville, in a renovated building that had once housed the offices of the diocesan newspaper. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same institution that had silenced Emma's voice was now home to an organization dedicated to amplifying the voices of abused children. Sarah stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, watching as Melissa Castellanos Rivera, now the center's executive director, prepared to address the crowd. In the 3 years since Emma's body had been found, Melissa had transformed her grief into purpose, earning her master's degree in social work and becoming a nationally recognized advocate for institutional reform. 3 years ago, "We learned that my sister Emma died because she tried to speak truth to power," Melissa said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd of supporters, survivors, and dignitaries. "Today, we're opening a center that will make sure other children have safe places to speak their truth and advocates who will listen without judgment, believe without question, and act without delay." The Emma Castellanos Center was more than just a memorial. It was a functioning child advocacy center that would provide forensic interviewing, trauma counseling, legal advocacy, and family support services. But its most innovative program was the Emma's Voice Project, which used Emma's own words from her diary to train educators, clergy, and community leaders to recognize the signs of abuse and respond appropriately. Manuel Castellanos, now 77 but sharp and engaged, cut the ribbon with hands that no longer shook with grief, but were steady with purpose. "Emma always wanted to help people," he said simply. "Now she can help people forever." 5 years later, August 2028. The documentary, The Voice That Wouldn't Stay Buried, the Emma Castellanos story, won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Investigative Documentary. Sarah watched the ceremony from her office at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, where she now directed the Cold Case Division. Emma's case had become a template for reinvestigating institutional abuse cases, and Sarah had trained dozens of investigators in the techniques that had finally brought Emma's killer to justice. The Emmy acceptance speech was given by the documentary's director, a former CNN journalist who'd covered the case from the beginning. "This award belongs to Emma Castellanos, who died at 17 but whose voice has saved countless children. It belongs to Detective Sarah Chen, who never stopped listening for that voice. And it belongs to every survivor who found the courage to speak truth even when the world wasn't ready to hear it." But the real impact was measured in numbers that would never make television. 1,247 children who would receive services through Emma Castellanos centers in 12 states. 43 institutional reforms prompted by Emma's law and similar legislation. 87 predators identified and prosecuted through cold case reinvestigations inspired by Emma's case. And countless children who grew up safer because adults finally understood the cost of comfortable silence. 7 years later, August 2030. Dr. Melissa Castellanos Rivera published her book, Surviving Silence, A Sister's Journey from Grief to Advocacy, on the 25th anniversary of Emma's disappearance. The book became a bestseller and required reading in social work programs across the country. But its most powerful chapter was titled Letters to Emma, actual correspondence Melissa had written to her dead sister over the years, processing her grief and finding her purpose. "Dear Emma," one letter began, "today I testified before Congress about the need for federal legislation protecting institutional abuse survivors. I was nervous, but then I remembered that you faced down a predator when you were 17. If you could do that, I can do this. Your courage is still contagious, even 25 years later." The federal legislation passed 6 months later, creating nationwide standards for child protection and mandatory reporting requirements that closed loopholes predators had exploited for decades. The Emma Castellanos National Child Protection Act was signed into law by a president who said, "Sometimes it takes the voice of one brave child to wake up an entire nation." Emma Castellanos died speaking truth to power. Today, we make sure that power finally listens. 10 years later, August 2033. Sarah Chen retired from law enforcement on her 60th birthday, but her last case was fitting: the successful prosecution of a ring of predators who'd been operating in Florida's foster care system for more than a decade. The investigation had used techniques pioneered during Emma's case, and 3 of the investigators on the team were graduates of the Emma Castellanos training program. At her retirement party, Sarah was surprised to receive a video message from Miguel Santos Jr., not the predator priest, but Emma's high school boyfriend
who'd been named after his grandfather. Miguel Jr. was now a successful attorney specializing in victims' rights cases.
Detective Chen, you probably don't remember me, but you interviewed me when I was 17 and Emma had just disappeared. You were kind when others were suspicious, and you never stopped fighting for the truth. Emma would have been so proud to know that her story helped change the world. Thank you for making sure her voice was heard. But the retirement gift that meant the most came from an unexpected source. A package arrived at Sarah's house with no return address, containing a hand-carved wooden box and a letter written in careful cursive. Detective Chen, you don't know me, but you saved my life. I was one of Miguel Santos's victims in Phoenix in 2007. I was 8 years old, and I never told anyone what he did to me. I carried that secret for 26 years, through addiction, failed relationships, and 2 suicide attempts. When Emma's story became public, I finally found the courage to seek help. I've been in therapy for 3 years, and I'm finally learning to live without shame. I'm married now with a daughter of my own, and I'm teaching her that her voice matters, that adults should listen when children speak, that courage is contagious. I made this box in my woodworking class at the community college. It's carved from oak wood, like the tree where Emma's diary was found. I wanted you to have it because you kept Emma's voice alive, and Emma's voice saved mine. Thank you for never giving up. Thank you for proving that truth matters more than comfort, that justice matters more than reputation, that children's lives matter more than institution secrets. A voice that's no longer silent. 15 years later, August 2038, the Emma Castellanos Center had grown into a national organization with locations in all 50 states. The annual Emma's Voice Conference brought together thousands of child advocates, survivors, law enforcement officers, and policymakers to share strategies for protecting children and supporting survivors. This year's keynote speaker was Dr. David Kim, Emma's former guidance counselor from Brooksville High School. Now in his 70s, Kim had spent the past 15 years training educators to recognize signs of abuse and respond appropriately. "I failed Emma Castellanos," Kim said simply, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "I saw the signs, the declining grades, the withdrawn behavior, the fear in her eyes, but I didn't ask the right questions. I didn't push when she said everything was fine. I accepted her silence because it was easier to confront the possibility that someone in our trusted community was hurting her." He paused, looking out at an audience of educators, social workers, and child advocates who'd learned from his failures and Emma's courage. Emma died because adults failed her, but her death taught us how to succeed for other children. Every child who finds safety because we ask the hard questions, every survivor who finds healing because we create space for their truth, every predator who faces justice because we prioritize children over institutions' secrets, that's Emma's legacy. She's still teaching us, still protecting children, still changing the world. The conference concluded with the annual reading of Emma's diary entries, words written by a 17-year-old girl who'd understood that some secrets were too dangerous to keep, even when speaking them might cost everything. "I'm scared, but I'm not going to be quiet anymore. Some things are more important than being safe, like making sure other kids don't go through what I'm going through. If something happens to me, I hope someone will read this and know that I tried to do the right thing." 20 years later, August 2043, Melissa Castellanos Rivera stood in the memorial garden behind what had once been St. Mary's Catholic Church. The building now housed the Emma Castellanos Center's national headquarters, and the youth group room where Emma had been terrorized was now a library filled with books about courage, justice, and healing. Melissa's daughter, Sophia, now 17, the same age Emma had been when she died, had organized a student-led conference on institutional accountability. Young people from across the country gathered to share strategies for creating safer communities and supporting survivors. "Aunt Emma was braver than most adults," Sophia told the assembled teenagers. "She died because she refused to let a predator continue hurting children. But her death wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning. Every time one of you finds the courage to speak up about abuse, every time you choose truth over comfort, every time you prioritize children's safety over institutions' secrets, you're continuing Emma's work." The memorial oak tree had grown tall and strong, its branches creating shade for multiple generations of children who played in its shadow. Like Emma's legacy, the tree had survived storms and drought, its roots growing deeper with each passing year.
its strength drawn from the soil that once held so many buried secrets. As the sun set over Brooksville on that August evening, Sarah Chen, now 80 years old, but still sharp, sat beneath the oak tree reading letters from survivors, law enforcement officers, and advocates who continued to be inspired by Emma's story.
One letter from a young police officer in Montana captured the enduring impact of Emma's courage. Detective Chen, I just closed my first cold case using techniques from the Emma Castellanos investigation. A 12-year-old girl who was murdered in 1998 by her youth pastor. Like Emma, she'd tried to speak up about abuse and was silenced. Like Emma, she'd kept a diary documenting her fears. And like Emma, her voice was finally heard because you proved that the dead can still demand justice, that buried secrets eventually surface, that courage is contagious across decades and continents. Thank you for teaching us that no case is ever truly cold as long as someone is willing to listen for the victim's voice. As darkness fell, Sarah looked up through the oak branches at the stars emerging in the Florida sky. Emma Castellanos had been dead for 38 years, but her voice was stronger than ever. It echoed in courtrooms where predators faced justice, in conference rooms where policies were reformed, in counseling sessions where survivors found healing, and in the hearts of children who'd learned that their truth mattered more than anyone's comfort. Emma had died trying to speak. In death, she'd finally found her voice. And that voice would continue speaking for as long as children needed protection, survivors needed support, and communities needed reminding that some silences are too dangerous to keep. The memorial plaque at the base of the oak tree glowed softly in the moonlight, its simple message as relevant as ever. In memory of Emma Castellanos and all children failed by those they trusted, may their courage inspire our vigilance. Emma's voice would never be silenced again. 25 years later, August 2048. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity for the final hearing in what legal scholars would later call the most significant institutional accountability case of the 21st century. The class action lawsuit against the Catholic Diocese of St. Petersburg had taken 7 years to reach this moment. But the $2.3 billion settlement would fund child protection programs nationwide and establish legal precedents that would reshape how institutions handled abuse allegations. Sarah Chen, now 85 and using a walker but mentally sharp as ever, sat in the front row next to Melissa Castellanos Rivera, who had become the lead advocate for the 847 plaintiffs in the case. The lawsuit had grown far beyond Father Santos's crimes to encompass a systematic pattern of abuse and cover-up spanning 5 decades. Judge Patricia Morales, herself a survivor of institutional abuse, read the settlement terms with a voice that carried the weight of history. This settlement acknowledges not only the harm done to individual survivors, but the institutional failures that enabled predators to operate with impunity for decades. The Diocese of St. Petersburg admits to systematic negligence in its handling of abuse allegations and agrees to implement comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future harm to children. But the most significant aspect of the settlement wasn't the monetary damages. It was the establishment of the Emma Castellanos Truth and Reconciliation Commission, modeled after similar bodies that had addressed historical injustices around the world. The commission would have subpoena power to compel testimony, access to sealed church documents, and a mandate to create a complete historical record of institutional abuse and cover-up. Archbishop Maria Santos, no relation to the predator priest, but chosen specifically for her history of advocating for abuse survivors, would chair the commission. In her acceptance speech, she spoke directly to Emma's legacy. Emma Castellanos died because adults prioritized institutional reputation over child safety. The Emma Castellanos Truth and Reconciliation Commission exists to ensure that such priorities are never again allowed to cost children their lives. We will seek truth, acknowledge harm, and create systemic change that honors the courage of survivors like Emma,
who spoke truth to power even when it cost them everything. 30 years later, August 2053. The Emma Castellanos Institute at the University of Florida had become the premier research center for studying institutional abuse and developing prevention strategies. Dr. Sofia Castellanos Martinez, Emma's great-niece, and now a renowned child psychologist, published her groundbreaking study, The Emma Effect: How One Voice Changed Child Protection Worldwide. The study documented measurable changes in child safety outcomes that could be traced directly to reforms inspired by Emma's case. Countries around the world had implemented Emma protocols, mandatory reporting systems, independent oversight bodies, and survivor-centered justice processes that had prevented an estimated 100,000 cases of institutional abuse over 3 decades. But perhaps the most powerful finding in Sofia's research was the documentation of what she termed inherited courage. The way Emma's story had been passed down through generations of families, inspiring children and adults to speak up about abuse, even when it was difficult or dangerous. Emma Castellanos has been dead for 48 years, but her influence on child protection has grown exponentially with each passing decade. She is the ancestor that every abuse survivor can claim, the voice that gives permission to speak, the proof that individual courage can reshape entire systems of power.
The study included interviews with thousands of survivors who credited Emma's story with giving them the courage to seek help. Their testimonies formed a chorus of voices that stretched across continents and generations. I was being abused by my stepfather for 3 years before I saw a documentary about Emma Castellanos. Learning that she died trying to protect other children made me realize I couldn't stay silent to protect my abuser. Maria, age 34, survivor from Mexico. As a teacher, I might have dismissed signs of abuse as behavioral problems if I hadn't learned about Emma's case during my training. Because of her story, I knew to ask the right questions and probably saved at least 12 children from ongoing abuse. James, age 45, educator from Canada. My daughter disclosed abuse to me last year. Without Emma's story teaching me that children tell the truth about these things, I might not have believed her or acted immediately. Instead, I called the police that same day. Patricia, age 52, mother from Australia. 35 years later, August 2058. The Emma Castellanos Global Child Protection Summit brought together world leaders, advocates, survivors, and researchers from 127 countries to address child abuse as a universal human rights issue. The summit was held in Geneva, but its opening ceremony was broadcast live from the Memorial Garden in Brooksville, where the oak tree planted in Emma's honor had grown to massive proportions. President Elena Rodriguez of the United States, herself a childhood abuse survivor, delivered the keynote address from beneath the oak tree's spreading branches. 35 years ago, the world failed Emma Castellanos. Adults who should have protected her instead protected her abuser. Systems that should have supported her instead silenced her. But Emma's death was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a global movement that has fundamentally changed how we protect children. The summit produced the Geneva Accords on Child Protection, a comprehensive international framework that established universal standards for institutional accountability, survivor support, and prevention programs. The accords were signed by representatives from every participating nation, creating binding legal obligations to protect children from institutional abuse. But the most moving moment of the summit came when a group of survivors, all now adults, read excerpts from Emma's diary in their native languages. Emma's words, originally written in English by a scared 17-year-old in Florida, were now spoken in Spanish, French, Mandarin, Arabic, Hindi, and dozens of other languages, proving that courage was truly universal and courage truly was contagious. 40 years later, August 2063. On the 40th anniversary of finding Emma's body, the Brooksville Memorial Garden had expanded into a 50-acre peace park that welcomed visitors from around the world. The original oak tree stood at the center of the park, surrounded by thousands of smaller trees planted by survivors, advocates, and family members who wanted to contribute to Emma's living legacy. Sarah Chen had died peacefully in her sleep 5 years earlier at age 90, but her influence lived on through the hundreds of investigators she'd trained and the thousands of cases that had been solved using techniques pioneered during Emma's investigation. Her autobiography, Listening for Buried Voices, A Detective's Journey, had become required reading in police academies worldwide. Melissa Castellanos Rivera, now 75, still visited the Memorial Garden every August 23rd, the anniversary of Emma's disappearance. This year, she brought her newest great-grandchild, a baby girl named Emma Rosa, to see the tree that had grown from her ancestors' courage. Your great-great-aunt Emma died when she was just 17 years old. But she's still protecting children all over the world. She's still teaching adults to listen when children speak. She's still proving that one voice, no matter how young, can change everything. The memorial wall now contained the names of 50,000 survivors who had found the courage to speak because of Emma's example. But it also contained the names of predators who had faced justice, institutions that had implemented meaningful reforms, and children who had been saved because adults had finally learned to prioritize truth over comfort. As the sun set over the Memorial Garden, visitors from 6 continents gathered for the annual candlelit vigil. They came from different cultures, spoke different languages, and had different stories of survival and healing. But they were united by Emma's voice, which had somehow transcended death to become a universal call for justice and protection for the most vulnerable. The vigil concluded with the reading of Emma's final diary entry, now translated into 127 languages and considered one of the most powerful statements about courage and sacrifice in human history. "I'm scared, but I'm not going to be quiet anymore. Some things are more important than being safe. Like making sure other kids don't go through what I'm going through. If something happens to me, I hope someone will read this and know that I tried to do the right thing." 50 years later, August 2073, the Emma Castellanos International Day for Child Protection had been officially recognized by the United Nations as an annual observance, marked every August 23rd in schools, communities, and government buildings around the world. What had begun as a local tragedy in a small Florida town had become a global symbol of the power of truth and the responsibility of adults to protect children.
Dr. Marcus Chen, no relation to Detective Sarah Chen, but named in her honor, published the definitive historical analysis of the Emma Castellanos case and its global impact in his book, The Voice That Changed the World: 50 Years of the Emma Effect. The book documented how Emma's story had influenced legislation in 89 countries, training programs that had reached 12 million adults, and prevention strategies that had been implemented in schools serving 500 million children. But perhaps the most remarkable finding in Dr. Chen's research was the documentation of what sociologists called the Emma generation. Children and adults who had been directly influenced by Emma's story and had gone on to dedicate their lives to child protection, survivor advocacy, and institutional reform. These thousands of individuals, scattered across the globe, had collectively prevented an estimated 2.5 million cases of child abuse through their work as teachers, counselors, law enforcement officers, legislators, and advocates. Emma's voice had literally multiplied across generations, creating an army of protectors who carried her courage into every corner of human society. The book's final chapter, titled The Eternal Voice, reflected on Emma's lasting impact. Emma Castellanos spoke for approximately 6 months in 2005 about the abuse she was suffering. Her voice was silenced after just 17 years of life. Yet 50 years after her death, her voice is stronger than ever, echoing in courtrooms and classrooms, in counseling sessions and legislative hearings, in the hearts of survivors and in the minds of protectors. She has become proof that some voices are too important to die, that some truths are too powerful to bury, that some courage is too contagious to contain. As the world marked the 50th anniversary of Emma's death, her voice continued to inspire new generations of advocates.
Children who had never heard her name still benefited from the systems her sacrifice had created. Adults who had never visited Brooksville still worked jobs that existed because Emma had spoken truth to power. The oak tree in the memorial garden had grown ancient and massive, its branches providing shade for countless visitors who came to remember, to heal, to find inspiration, and to add their voices to the chorus that Emma had started with her courage. Emma Castellanos was 17 years old when she died. She had been dead for 50 years, but her voice was eternal, carried forward by every person who chose courage over comfort, truth over silence, and protection over reputation. Her story would continue as long as children needed protection, as long as survivors needed support, and as long as the world needed reminding that individual courage can reshape entire systems of power. Emma's voice would never be silenced again. It had become part of the very fabric of human consciousness, woven into the moral imagination of a species that had finally learned, thanks to one brave girl from Florida, that children's voices matter more than adult comfort, that truth matters more than reputation, and that courage, once unleashed, can never be contained. The Memorial Garden Visitors Book contained millions of entries from people around the world, but the most recent entry, written by a young girl who had traveled from Thailand with her family, captured Emma's enduring influence. Thank you, Emma, for teaching me that my voice matters. I'm only 12, but because of you, I know that speaking truth is more important than being polite. Because of you, I know that adults should listen when children speak. Because of you, I know that I can be brave. Emma's voice lived on in that girl and in millions of others who had learned from her sacrifice. Her death was tragic, but her legacy was triumph. The triumph of courage over fear, truth over silence, and love over power. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.